Out of My Head, the Imaginary Creatures of Josep Baqué is a compendium of this sort of lost artist's entire canon, which he drew between roughly 1932 and his death in 1967, and never told a soul about. Baqué was born in Barcelona just before the turn of the 20th century. He was a police officer directing a traffic circle. He began drawing these imaginary creatures at the end of the Second Spanish Republic during the early to mid-1930s, and then he continued drawing them throughout the Franco dictatorship, which lasted roughly from 1939 to 1975. Baqué himself died in 1967 and left behind this massive bestiary. They're basically framed up like a natural history treatise. So each one is supposed to be a representative of its species or phylum. Baqué is playful though, in that he actually seems to have them demarcated off into their own boxes, but they're aware of each other. Sometimes one seems to want to reach out and bite the other. They're extremely self-aware of their own emotions, of their own fear. They seem to be in some way communicating with each other, but also communicating with us, which is weird because Baqué wasn't showing these drawings to anybody. So who was the audience that would have recognized that these creatures are feeling trapped or feeling anxiety? If it was just him, then he was having a pretty intimate relationship with his creation. I first discovered this artist in 2017 in a group show at the American Folk Art Museum called Vestiges and Verse. The chief curator, Valerie Rousseau, invited me to talk about Baqué. The presentation went extremely well, and Valerie offered to introduce me to the collector who had the entire bestiary, and I went to Amsterdam to view it. And then from there I went on to Barcelona to retrace the artist's steps. His great-nephew, Steve, thinks that there was maybe some sort of psychic break that happened at some point in the 1920s where he began retreating into the shadows more. And that's possible, but he had this public life where he had to be out amongst the hoi polloi every day. And then at the same time, he's hiding away all of these extreme visuals, grotesqueness, sexuality, hybridity, pure imagination. I had to take all of these different contexts and try to synthesize them into something that would make sense of this enterprise. The million-dollar question is, what was the purpose of all of this? He didn't do it for money, he didn't sell the drawings, he didn't show them to anybody. And yet they seem to stand in some ways for the emotional content of what he was going through. There's a journal-like aspect. Some of them have visual puns. You have an elephant who has blue veins and it has this very worried look on its face, so it's sort of like a visual pun for cold blood. Other times you see caricatures of people who would be seen walking around the traffic circle where he was policing. You'll see them turned into like a caterpillar, but they'll clearly have sort of an old grandpa's face getting angry at passersby. Other times you'll see references to sociology and politics. There's one spider-like creature that has what is clearly the three-tiered crown of the Pope. So was he making some sort of commentary about the complicity of the papacy in the rise of nationalism and fascism, particularly in Spain and Italy? We don't really know. Baqué himself was a lifelong Catholic. Amongst the few artifacts that still exist amongst his personal effects are a handful of prayer cards. There's a lot of different themes, motifs, approaches to the creatures. They hold together because of his technique. You can see the wonder of the creatures. You can see how on the same page he would use the same color palette, and then when he goes to the next page, the color palette would shift. So in all likelihood, he drew every creature that's on one page at the same time. A lot of the creatures actually pose, they show off, they're very exhibitionist, they display androgyny, they are flamboyant. The question was, is he using these to express a hidden part of his lifestyle that would have actually gotten him arrested or killed in that time? This is the first ever compendium of his work and also an attempt at a biography. He was certainly undiscovered in his lifetime. Whether he was an outsider artist or not remains to be seen. It doesn't seem that he had formal training in the arts, but he may have. The obsession of the work and for how long it went on may suggest that he was somewhere on the spectrum. The title that I chose out of my head had a double entendre. In some ways there is an unhinged sense. I mean, who could create so many creatures that look so weird and so otherworldly? And then at the same time, this particular presentation was clearly drawn of his own imagination, of his own way of seeing the world. And he presented an ecology that was as far-reaching as, say, H.P. Lovecraft or Dr. Seuss. It's not just about imaginary creatures, but it sort of questions the limitations of our knowledge.